Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Lauren Artilles, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so thrilled to welcome you to our first virtual Harvard Square Book Circle meeting, featuring Merve Emre presenting her newly released The Annotated Mrs. Dalloway. I hope you're all doing well today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us virtually. Through virtual events like today's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Our fantastic fall lineup is off to a great start, and we've got a bustling September and October coming up. So please visit harvard.com/events to check out our upcoming schedule, where you can also sign up for our newsletter. Closed captions are available for this event. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable the captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase the Annotated Mrs. Dalloway on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like today's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. While sadly, for the time being, our usual small in-store book group meetings aren't possible, we're delighted that the virtual format opens up new opportunities, like having Merve with us today. So we'll open our event with a presentation from Merve about Virginia Woolf's iconic novel, Mrs. Dalloway, and her work on the beautiful new annotated version of the text. So at any point during the talk, you're encouraged to share your thoughts via the chat feature. And you can also ask questions at any time by entering them in the Q&A box. After Merve's presentation, I'll return to the screen to facilitate discussion by reading your questions and comments. And I'm sorry that the video function will not be available to attendees during this talk. Finally, as you may have experienced in previous virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise, so if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I am so excited to introduce our featured speaker. Merve Emre is an associate professor of English literature at the University of Oxford. She is the author and editor of several books, including The Personality Brokers, which was selected as one of the best books of 2018 by many US and UK publications and adapted as the 2021 HBO documentary feature film Persona. She's a 2020 fellow of the Wissenschaft College Zoo Berlin and a regular contributor to the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books. Today, she'll be discussing The Annotated Mrs. Dalloway, an illuminating companion to the source text that draws on decades of Woolf scholarship as well as countless primary sources, including Woolf's private diaries and notes on writing. Michael Cunningham calls the work a remarkable act of excavation. And Elif Batman writes, "I'm tempted to say, at last, the Mrs. Dalloway we deserve. But let's face it, this Mrs. Dalloway is way better than we deserve." Merve Emre's wide-ranging, rigorous, illuminating, and affecting annotations, alongside the generous and brilliantly curated illustrations, shine new light on Woolf's London, Mrs. Dalloway's consciousness, and the tragedy of Septimus Smith. So without further ado, I'm so delighted to turn the digital podium over to you, Merve. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Can everybody hear me okay? You can hear me all right? Good. Thank you for having me. I am tuning in from my dining room. I normally do these kinds of events from my office, but the Wi-Fi is out there. So normally I have behind me a much more impressive stack of books rather than a 500-piece Star Wars puzzle. But thank you for joining me tonight. So back in June, I taught a four-week-long class on Mrs. Dalloway at the 92nd Street Y. And what I'm going to present to you tonight comes from the first lecture of that lecture series. So I'm going to try to present to you the first half of the first lecture. And the other four of them, the other 3.5 of them largely follow the outline of the annotated Mrs. Dalloway. So if you're interested in where it goes from there, you can always find a version of the lecture series more or less in the book itself. So let me share my screen with you. And then we can start. Oops. Hold on, sorry. My PowerPoint appears to have closed my presentation. Okay, now let me share the screen. Excellent. There we go. So I imagine you can all see that. Okay. So one of the first things that people ask me when I tell them that I annotated a new edition of Mrs. Dalloway is why Mrs. Dalloway and why now? So I thought I would answer those two questions for you. The first, personally, why Mrs. Dalloway for me, and the second, a little bit more politically and historically, why Mrs. Dalloway now? What is it that Virginia Woolf's 1925 novel still has to offer us in our very unique present, a present that I think is indexed by the fact that almost 60 of you are tuning in to a Zoom webinar to hear me speak instead of us gathering together in the Harvard bookstore to have this event. So first, why Mrs. Dalloway for me? One of the stories that I tell in the introduction to the Annotated Mrs. Dalloway is how the first time I read Mrs. Dalloway, I was very, very young, too young to understand it properly. And that when I read it, I immediately sent it to a friend of mine, a boy. And that when I sent it to him, I must have included in it a letter in which I told him that he and I reminded me of Clarissa Dalloway and Peter Walsh. And for those of you who have read the novel, you will remember that Clarissa Dalloway is the 50-something-year-old upper class, posh woman who is organizing her party on the day that the novel opens, the day that the novel chronicles, and that Peter Walsh is her suitor, whom she hasn't seen for some time, but who feels as if he has been sort of jilted by her when they were young. Anyway, I sent this note to my friend, and he wrote a letter back that after 20-something years, I still managed to keep. And his letter is what you are seeing on the screen. And he writes to me, "Oh, and by the way, you were wrong." Or maybe, and that is crossed out. So he was going to give me the benefit of the doubt, but he didn't. "Oh, and by the way, you were wrong. We're not Mrs. Dalloway and Peter Walsh. We are Jake Barnes and Lady Ashley from The Sun Also Rises by one Ernest Hemingway. Don't jump to conclusions halfway through. Read the book through to the end, the very end. Okay, maybe you weren't wrong. Maybe we just have two different perspectives." And for those of you who have also read your Hemingway recently, you might remember that Jake Barnes and Lady Ashley are the impotent American journalist and the sexually insatiable British divorcee. So neither of these character pairings really suits two 11-year-olds from Long Island particularly well. But one of the things that I like about this somewhat embarrassing exchange is the desire or the impulse to identify with these characters in order to make sense of whatever nascent or unformed feelings we were feeling at this tender young age. And one of the things that I discuss in my introduction to the Annotated Mrs. Dalloway is how character identification for someone like Virginia Woolf was not a merely childish pastime or a bad or uninformed way of approaching a text. Instead, she was intimately interested, passionately interested in how a novelist might actually lay a small spit of land between characters and the reader, so that the reader could see something in those characters that would look familiar to them. A way of feeling, a way of thinking, the pressure of an emotion, the structure or the texture of a particular kind of relationship. And so one of the reasons that I want to try to redeem my first reading of Mrs. Dalloway is because I think it intuits something about Woolf's understanding of character. So what precisely does it intuit? One thing that it intuits, and this is taken from the introduction to the Annotated Mrs. Dalloway, is that a fictional character is a marvelously and perplexingly hybrid creature. She is a piece of writing, and as such is made up of words, of images, of imaginings, writes the great literary critic John Frau. But she also requires the pretense of existence, the belief that from behind these words, there rises a distinctly human shape. It is this shape who beckons to her readers, who swiftly and assuredly ushers them into the author's world as fellow travelers. It is she who extends the invitation to her party. Character was incredibly important to Virginia Woolf, and of course, you can see that emphasis on character placed front and center in the title of the novel, Mrs. Dalloway, which some of you may know started its life as At Home or A Party, and then was changed to The Hours, and finally became Mrs. Dalloway, although other variations of the title that Woolf tried on included A Lady at Home, A Lady's Portrait, which is obviously riffing on Henry James's Portrait of a Lady, and other titles that told you that this was first and foremost a novel not only about a character, but a novel that theorized what character was and how character was created. Now, at the same time that Virginia Woolf was working on Mrs. Dalloway, she was also writing the essays in The Common Reader. And one of the most famous essays in The Common Reader, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, concerns character and how it is that modernist writers in particular need to think about character as opposed to their realist counterparts, their 19th century novel writing counterparts. And to me, one of the most extraordinary ideas that Virginia Woolf articulates in that essay, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, is the idea of character reading, which she describes as an activity that the young participate in when they need it for their adventures in order to read the characters of the people that they encounter, mostly in order to build friendships or to pursue romances. But that the novelist is a kind of perpetual youth who is always trying to get at what makes a person singular, but on the other hand, also what grounds them in the particular history and the particular society from which they emerge. And how it is that through character reading, we can, on the one hand, place a character, understand them as something larger than themselves, as part of a web of relations, and at the same time appreciate that within each character, within each person, there exists an inexhaustible world of life and thought that is entirely unique to them. And that this inexhaustibility, this respect for the singularity of others, will allow the author to bridge the gulf, as Woolf writes in Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, between the writer and her unknown reader. And she writes quite beautifully, the writer must get into touch with his reader by putting before him something which he recognizes, which therefore stimulates his imagination and makes him willing to cooperate in the far more difficult business of intimacy. And so for my friend and I, reading at a young age, that is what Clarissa Dalloway and Peter Walsh were, even if our identities, let's say, did not correspond to theirs in any obvious sort of way. Why was Virginia Woolf interested in character at the moment when she was interested in character? The other very famous line from Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown that some of you might know is the claim that on or about December 1910, human character changed. All human relations have shifted, those between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children. And when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. Why 1910 precisely? Different people have proposed different things, including the height of the British Empire and the height of sort of imperial capitalism that was fully coming to fruition in 1910. Other people have suggested Freud and the advent of psychoanalysis and the popularization of its language of subjectivity and selfhood. Still others have suggested that Woolf was reading Dostoevsky and thinking very carefully about the difference between different national contexts and ideas of character. But whatever the reason might be, it seemed clear to Woolf that there needed to be a different way of constructing character in order to register how human relations had shifted. And this is one of the things that Mrs. Dalloway, I think, does very, very carefully. And the longer version of this lecture and what a number of the annotations, but also the introduction to the Annotated Mrs. Dalloway set out to do is to show you precisely how Woolf thinks about character, how the different techniques that she uses for constructing this very complicated novel and this very meticulously planned novel are ultimately all in the service of creating her characters, most notably Clarissa Dalloway, but also Septimus Smith, who's the second hinge of the novel, and then all of the characters that she brings to their aid as she writes in her diaries. Why read Mrs. Dalloway now? So if you think about what Woolf wrote in Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, that on or around 1910 human character changed, I have been thinking over the past 18 months since I started annotating the Mrs. Dalloway, actually, that I wonder if on or about March 2020, human character might also have changed, and whether or not what we have experienced and lived through for the past 18 months has had any sort of effect on the way that we think about ourselves as characters, the way that we think about our relationships to other people in the world, the way we think about our place in history and social relations more generally. And as we were speaking about just before the webinar started, it's difficult for me to read Mrs. Dalloway this time around and not notice the fact that Clarissa Dalloway is a survivor of the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic, that one of the first details we get about her is that she looks paler, her face is whiter than it was before, and that her heart has been affected. And the word influenza comes from the Italian word for an influence on the heart. And it's impossible to miss that, and it hits differently given the pandemic, given living through lockdown, but also given the fact that now we are starting to come out of lockdown and the idea of returning to normal probably seems anxiety inducing and uncomfortable for many of us. And I have been thinking about how Mrs. Dalloway is in fact the greatest novel of coming out of lockdown, as Clarissa does, and as much of London does after the war, and learning to live or refusing to live with the memory of mass death in a social system that refuses to take responsibility for it. And if Clarissa Dalloway, going around London, planning her party, trying to figure out how to wring the most out of life that she possibly can after being shut in due to illness, due to war, represents one aspect of coming out of lockdown and wanting to simply seize on all of the vitality that the world has to offer you, then Septimus coming out, walking around Regent's Park, hallucinating, seeing his friend that has died, and believing that he has committed a crime, that someone has committed a crime and that nobody is being held responsible for it, seems to me to represent the other hinge or the other aspect of lockdown. And right now, as I at least think about beginning another semester of teaching in the next several weeks, it does feel like we are right at the cusp of trying to understand whether we can go back to living in some sort of uncomplicated or normal way, or whether we will continue to have to grieve and learn how to grieve after 18 months of unprecedented death. So I'm actually going to stop there because I've been speaking for about 25 minutes. The rest of the lecture goes on to talk a little bit about the influences for Mrs. Dalloway, including Woolf's very good friend, Kitty Max. It shows you a couple of the different manuscript pages that Woolf was working with when she was sort of planning out the novel. And it ultimately makes an argument about why Clarissa Dalloway, who started her life as a character, a minor character in Woolf's novel, The Voyage Out, then became the main character in her short story, Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, and finally clamored for a novel of her own. And so the rest of this lecture and a great deal of the introduction to the Annotated Mrs. Dalloway makes an argument for why it had to be the novel form that Virginia Woolf ultimately claimed for Clarissa Dalloway. So why don't I stop there and we can go to the Q&A, and if there are questions that tap into different parts of the rest of the lecture, I can always pull the screen back up. Okay. So would you like me to take the questions myself, or are you going to read them out to me?
Oh, I'm happy to read them. Yeah, so we've got a couple. Great. We've got a couple of great ones to start. I want to encourage everyone who's watching, if you have a question at any time, you can either put it in the Q&A box or the chat, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. All right, so this first question is asking, how was the novel received at the time it was published?
So it was published to fairly mixed reviews. There were, the New York Times, for instance, praised it as a sort of instant masterpiece or classic. Some people compared it to other modernist artworks, including the paintings of Duncan Grant, Vanessa Bell of the Bloomsbury Group, the Modern Ballet. But then Woolf was quite hurt by reviews that described it as being too mannered. She was particularly hurt by a review that described Septimus Smith as a great piece of irrelevance in the entire novel. And so there was absolutely no guarantee that it would be canonized and read and beloved in the way that it is today. And this is one of the things that's fascinating to me as a practicing critic too. I always wonder whether there are novels that get only middling reviews today that 96 years later will be part of the canon, but that we cannot see from the vantage point of the present. But that's a great question. Thank you for it.
This is personally, I would love to know when did it discover a critical resurgence if it was only middlingly received in the beginning?
I think we owe a great deal of its popularity to the feminist critics of the 1970s, particularly those that read the novel alongside Woolf's long essay, A Room of One's Own. And I think we especially owe a great deal to Woolf's biographer, Hermione Lee. And if you haven't read her wonderful biography of Virginia Woolf, I strongly encourage you to read it, because it is one of the best biographies I have ever read. And at the end of it, Hermione gives a kind of afterword where she talks about how when she read English at Oxford, people did not read Woolf, and how one of the reasons she wrote this biography was because she wanted people to. And that's not all that long ago. That's not that long ago. So we tend to think of her as a pretty secure, as her position is fairly secure in the canon of modernist literature. But to put it in a much kind of broader perspective, it is one of the newer positions, I think.
That's fascinating. I did not know that. All right, our next question is asking, I'd love to hear about some of the resonances you discovered between Woolf's own life and Mrs. Dalloway. I guess either the character or the novel as a whole.
No, that's a wonderful question, because Woolf, particularly in her middle period novels, so Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, Orlando, which some of you might know she wrote for her lover Vita Sackville West, or is based on her lover Vita Sackville West, and The Waves. Those are all, I think, intensely biographical novels, and she mines not just her own life, but also the lives of her friends for her characters. I think the resonance that Woolf herself talks about most openly and most painfully is how she draws on her own experiences of mental illness, of psychotic break, and of hallucinating for the character of Septimus Smith. And there's a wonderful and really quite agonizing diary entry where she writes, "Do the mad," she says, I'm in the thick of the mad scene in Regent's Park." And she writes, "Does it try me? I have to squint. It tries me so bad, I can only write 50 words at a time." And when you read that, you realize that there are some very direct parallels between the content of his hallucinations and the content of her hallucinations. So for instance, when she had her first break, she believed that she heard the birds chirping to her in Greek. And that's something that he hears as well. And if you look at the manuscript of Mrs. Dalloway, you actually see her working on her Greek exercises and her essay on not knowing Greek at the same time that she's writing these hallucinations. So she's drawing on that, not just for his insane vision of the world, as she puts it in her diary, but for her own understanding and education in Greek. So I find that quite fascinating. The first time she tried to commit suicide, she threw herself from a window, but it was a first floor window, so it couldn't really do much harm. But those of you who've read the novel know that that's how Septimus Smith commits suicide too. He opens the large Bloomsbury window and he throws himself out. And so I would point to that. But I mean, there are many, many other things that I could say, and I'd be happy to come back to it after I've answered some of the other questions, maybe, because that's one of the things that the annotations really gets into, are the places where she was quite explicit in her diary about drawing from her life to shape her characters.
All right, Kenny is asking, okay, he listened to Annette Benning's reading of the text and her versions had differences to your annotated one. There's a UK and a US version. So why did you choose the version of the text that you did?
That's a great question, Kenny. So there are two main differences between the UK and the US version. The first is that the UK and the US version have a different number of interludes. So Woolf refused to call them chapters. And those of you who've read the novel know that you don't have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, but rather that you have line breaks in between these interludes. And that when the American version was initially printed, 2 of the line breaks took place on where one page ended. And so the other page beginning didn't let you see that it was a proper line break. And so when that version was reproduced, those breaks weren't reproduced. So there were actually a different number of sections or interludes in the different versions. There are also about like 300 sort of minor differences of phrasing, of punctuation between them. But the second largest difference is that at the proof stage, Woolf kept a line in the British edition that she struck from the American edition. And it's a pretty momentous line. So it comes right at the moment when Clarissa Dalloway, she's at her party, she has heard the news of Septimus Smith's suicide, and she sort of goes off to meditate on what this means and to think about him and to think about why she did it. And she thinks that she was glad he had done it, that he had thrown his treasure, that he had plunged with his treasure. And then she says, he made her feel the beauty, semicolon, made her feel the fun. And that whole sentence is struck from the British version, but it stays in the American version. And critics, I think, rightfully have made quite a big deal out of this. And one of the reasons they've made a big deal out of it is because if you keep that line in, it suggests a very different kind of relationship between those two characters, between Clarissa Dalloway and Septimus Smith. Because imagine what kind of a person you have to be in order for someone's suicide to make you feel the beauty or feel the fun of your own life. And then layer on top of that what that means if the person who feels the beauty and feels the fun is a member of the British ruling class, and the person who has committed suicide is a working class, aspirationally middle class veteran who has been completely let down by the government, by its capacity to provide for its veterans, by the widespread disbelief in shell shock as an actual ailment of any kind. So I think keeping the line in invites us to judge, and invites us to a fairly damning judgment of Clarissa Dalloway. And it sits much closer to where the short story, Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, ends, which is with Clarissa Dalloway in a glove store buying gloves and thinking how many young men had to die so that life could go on for people like her and Richard. And so striking the line, I think, preserves a certain degree of ambiguity, whereas keeping it feels, to me at least, like a much kind of clearer judgment of Clarissa's rapture at the end of the novel. So those are the two biggest versions. And then, like I said, there are, the two biggest differences between the US and the UK. And like I said, there are about 300 other kind of smaller things here or there.
Yeah, that's a huge difference, I would say.
Well, it's interesting as the editor too, whether you choose to keep that line in or not. And the wonderful literary critic Paul St. Amour has a really lovely reading of the decision itself, where he basically says, like, it's two different novels making that decision, right? And you can't not make the decision. You have to choose one or the other. And ultimately, on some level, which one you choose is not only a question of how you want judgment to work in the novel, but also how you exercise your own judgment in trying to determine which one makes the novel better, what the relationship is of that very, very small part to the whole. And so it's a really interesting decision to make, but also a really interesting decision to think about, I think.
Definitely. All right, we've got a question from Martha, who's asking, why do you think Mrs. Dalloway is more respected, it seems, I guess, in Virginia Woolf's canon than To the Lighthouse, The Waves, or Orlando, etc.?
I don't know that it's more respected necessarily. I mean, I think of Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse as more or less sort of occupying the same status. I mean, I think The Waves and Orlando are just a little bit more difficult to read, and they're certainly more difficult to teach, particularly something like The Waves, where there are just basic questions about like who's speaking and whether it's one person speaking or multiple characters speaking, right? But I don't know that as a novel it's necessarily more respected. I think that it is probably more widely taught, would be my guess. And I think because it wears, I mean, and this is something interesting to me, because I taught a class on Mrs. Dalloway for a friend who teaches it at CUNY, and her students were quite open about the fact that they didn't understand why we should be reading a novel about this posh white lady throwing a party in when was this? In April 2021. And one of the things that I tried to point out to them was that it's an intensely political novel, right? It's a deeply, bitingly satirical political novel. And it is really taking to task a kind of English ruling class hypocrisy, a belief in stoicism, an unwillingness to take responsibility for the suffering that the government has inflicted onto millions of people. And that first line, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, really fools you into thinking that that's what the novel is about, the consumption of a luxury good like cut flowers from a street like Bond Street. But in fact, it's a fairly vicious critique, I think, of the society in which Woolf was living, but also the society that supported her art and that supported her art making. And so to me, that's maybe one of the reasons why it's more taught, is because you get to teach everything about Woolf's style, about her approach to character and her approach to consciousness. But you also get to sort of educate your students in the history of the war and the empire. And the empire in this novel is very much in the details. And those details include things like the statuary that Peter Walsh sees when he walks through London, that you can still see if you walk through London today. And it includes, critiques of places like Oxford, where I teach. And so those critiques, I think, still feel quite fresh to anyone who reads it, but also to anybody who teaches it today.
Building off of that, Esperanza is asking about how the flowers operate as a metaphor.
That's a wonderful question, Esperanza. I think I would point you to the fact that in Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, the famous first sentence of Mrs. Dalloway was not Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. It was Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the gloves herself. And one of the things I like thinking about, particularly in the annotations, are these sort of small, apparently small changes that Woolf made from her first drafts to the final draft. And of course, that first line, gloves, flowers, it's one word. What's the big deal? But it reads completely differently. And it reads completely differently to me for two reasons. I mean, the difference between a glove or a flower, it's the narrator who speaks the first sentence. It's not a piece of dialogue. The narrator delivers the first sentence. The reason it reads differently is because a glove is an inanimate object. You buy a glove, you can wear it over and over and over again. It is not something that you sort of discard after a single use, at least not the kinds of gloves that Mrs. Dalloway is off to buy, which are these sort of beautiful, in the short story, these sort of long, beautiful French gloves, these white gloves with these button-up pearls on the side. But flowers are perishable. And the moment you cut a flower is the moment that it begins to die. And the change from glove to flower, I think, invites death into the novel from the very first sentence. And for me, what supports that reading is the fact that Woolf then went and revised the first 4 paragraphs of Mrs. Dalloway so that the language of Clarissa Dalloway, remembering how when she was a girl, she used to open the window at her country home and plunge out into the air. That language of opening the window and plunging out is a very precise echo of Septimus Smith opening the window and plunging out of it later on in the novel. And so there are these small ways that the specter of death is always entwined with the feeling of life. And flowers, to me, is the first sign that we get of that. Speaking a little bit more prosaically, I mean, when we were locked down here, our house abuts the grounds of the college where I teach, and it was kind of emptied out of students. And we had an unusually beautiful spring and summer in England, where, at least in Oxford, it only rained for 3 days in like 5 months, which is very strange. But the flowers during that time were extraordinary. And when we were allowed to leave the house for our once a day daily exercise, we would go
constitutional.
For our constitutional, we would go walk in the gardens, and the flowers felt, on the one hand, alive and filled with a kind of vitality and a sight for animals and for animals like, bees and butterflies congregating. I mean, they were sort of teeming with life. And at the same time, they were completely indifferent to our presence. Like, it didn't matter that we were there for them. And I think that was the first time that feeling of loneliness or of isolation spurring you to want to make contact with something living, and then realizing that the living things around you have no use for you. That made me think a little bit differently about Virginia Woolf's flowers.
All right. Margaret in the chat is asking, what new insights has your work generated? I guess for you about Virginia's work, or more broadly, what was the process of compiling all this research like for you?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Margaret. I mean, I can talk about sort of particular things in the text that I felt like I discovered or identified that others hadn't. I mean, one thing I will simply say is that the joy of annotating is that you do sort of put together a party, which is that you're drawing on lots of other people's voices. And you are trying to incorporate as much other scholarship as you can to try to give the reader access to the richest possible picture of the novel. So I would maybe, I mean, I can talk about the new insights, but I think any annotator would be remiss not to simply identify all of the work that all of the other work that she has built on in order to create something like this. So for me, the most interesting moment, the most interesting new insight, readers of the novel, and I talk about this actually in one of the later lectures that I did for the 92nd Street Y, which was on technologies of timekeeping in the novel and how it is that a novel keeps time and keeps time in a way that's different from the way that the empire keeps time, because the British Empire in particular is so preoccupied with its timekeeping devices. And one of the ways we see this in Mrs. Dalloway is with the constant presence of Big Ben, with the clocks on Harley Street ringing, with the mention of E. Dent & Co., the official timekeeper for the empire, the people that were responsible for actually building the timepieces for Charles Darwin's boats, for various other kinds of expeditions. So the novel is very interested in how the empire keeps time with its clocks. But one of the things that I discovered when I was annotating was that Woolf has all sorts of different ways of using the novel to keep its own time. And for me, one of the places you see this most obviously is in this very kind of long and strange interlude that you get about midway through the novel on proportion. So those of you who have read the novel will remember that right around at exactly noon, Septimus and his wife Rezia go to see the doctor. And the doctor is very strict about only seeing people for 45 minutes. And so the first part of that chapter from 12 to 12:45 is Septimus and Rezia at the doctor. And then the second part of that interlude from 12:45 to 1:30 is a long digression on proportion. And people have often wondered, why is this here? It feels out of place. It's this kind of mock epic allegorical interlude. But when you actually type the manuscript out, which I did, one of the things you discover is that the number of words it takes Woolf to get from noon to 12:45 is, give or take 10 words, exactly the same as the number of words it takes her to get from 12:45 to 1:30. And so at the same time that the novel is decrying proportion and criticizing the British legislators and politicians and doctors and all of the other people who would use this idea of proportion to try to discipline those who are ill, those who are ailing, those who are suffering. At the same time, the novel itself is participating in its own extraordinary act of proportion by allocating the same number of words to the exact same amount of time, the 45 minutes that passes in the first part and the 45 minutes that passes immediately after in the interlude on proportion. And that felt to me like a kind of like a real wow moment, because this novel has been around for a long time. It's been mined by many, many, many different people to make different kinds of arguments. And I think that feeling that you've actually discovered something new, that feels quite special, and that you can kind of spin it into this whole argument about how it is that novels keep their own time against other forms of imperialist timekeeping.
Fascinating. All right, we've got a comment from Meg who says, evening gloves made of fine kidskin from that period were very perishable and often discarded after one wearing, after being stained by wine or the perspiration of many dance partners' hands after an evening of waltzes.
Okay, thanks for that, Meg. I mean, I think in the short story, she's quite clear about the fact that the gloves are things that are keepsakes for her. So, I mean, I appreciate that comment, but I still don't think it actually changes the argument that gloves are significantly different from flowers, in that if you were to hand someone a glove, they would probably not see death in it. And that the glove, although at some point it begins its life, although the glove, of course, begins its life as part of a living being, by the time it actually gets to the person's hand, it doesn't have the same feeling of lost vitality or rapidly draining vitality that the flower has.
All right, another viewer would like to hear you talk more about how class works in the novel.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of my favorite critics of Woolf is the great critic Erich Auerbach, who concludes his book Mimesis with a discussion of the brown stocking in To the Lighthouse. And one of the things that Auerbach argues about Woolf is that she represents the sort of pinnacle of a particularly democratic approach to representing character. And she represents that pinnacle in part because she believes that anybody in the world can be taken and character read and can be the subject of a novel. And there's this wonderful moment toward the end of the novel where Clarissa Dalloway is actually looking at this old woman in the house across from her. And she is doing a kind of character reading, trying to think what it is that this woman is thinking, that one sees one's neighbors all the time, but never takes the time to really think about what's on their mind. And you realize as you're reading that, like, why is this novel about Clarissa Dalloway? It could be about this other woman across the street. According to Woolf's theory of character, it could be about anybody, right? And one of the great things about Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, that essay that I talked to you about that's in the Common Reader, one of the great things about that is that she is looking at a woman she calls Mrs. Brown on the train compartment with her. And she starts making up an entire story for her. And she says, well, she could be anybody. It doesn't matter who she is. That's very good in theory. And I think Auerbach sort of has the theory, right? And Woolf is committed to that in her essays. But then one of the interesting things that you see about class in the novel itself is that different characters, in part based on their class, get different amounts of attention or have their thoughts and feelings mined to a different degree. And if you're interested in class in the novel, I would really urge you to look at the way that Virginia Woolf models the character of Lucy, the maid, or of any of the characters, any of the servants that are participating in putting the party together toward the end of the novel, because they are thinking only about the people that they are serving. And there's very little room in their minds for the kind of long remembrances that you get with a character like Clarissa Dalloway, or even a character like Lady Bruton, or a character like Peter Walsh. And so I find that incredibly interesting because it's a point where it's a place or a nexus where Woolf's theory and then what she's actually doing in the novel, I think, butt up against one another. And there's a wonderful book by Alison Light called Mrs. Woolf and the Servants that actually gets into the details of how Woolf treated her own servants, particularly her servant Nellie Boxall, with whom she had a very contentious kind of relationship, and how her novels, on the one hand, do a great deal of work to try to ironize her own class privilege, but at the same time are often sort of reinscribing that class privilege.
Okay, another question, random question, but do you ever think about writing a novel? I love your New Yorker articles.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. No, I have, I mean, I haven't, I don't think I'm brave enough. maybe one day. There's a question in the chat which says, did Woolf's indictment of the medical profession in the novel mirror her own experiences with doctors? Yes, I mean, and I think when you look at the drafts, one of the things that you see is that the doctors were originally written to be much more buffoonish characters. And in particular, the part that I think really mirrors her own experience is that the doctors to Septimus prescribe rest and isolation away from Resia in particular. And one of the things that Woolf in her diaries talks about being most bothered by is the fact that the doctors wanted to keep her from her family, and often did keep her, isolated her from her family when she was at her absolute worst moments. So yes, I think absolutely. And then I think more broadly, one of the things you see in that great proportion interlude is a critique of the more generally eugenicist underpinnings of the way that the mentally ill were treated in the UK at the time.
I have a personal question, which
Yes.
is, do you have any favorite passages from the novel, or any favorite parts in particular?
So there is, yes, I will actually pull it up. Hold on. My eyes are sort of looking this way because I'm just going to pull up the precise part. I won't be able to quote it exactly from memory. Let's see. So it's the moment when she is thinking about the kiss between her and Sally.
Oh, that's my favorite part too.
That's your favorite part. Yes. For some reason, I don't have the book next to me because I'm at my house right now. You don't happen to have it in front of you, do you?
I don't, but I do have it's like right before she kisses her, but when she's thinking about like how she
Oh yes, here it is.
was.
Here it is. I just have to remember the right opening. It was a sudden revelation, a tinge like a blush, which one tried to check. And then as it spread, one yielded to its expansion and rushed to the farthest verge, and there quivered and felt the world come closer, swollen with some astonishing significance, some pressure of rapture, which split its thin skin and gushed and poured with an extraordinary alleviation over the cracks and sores. And it's wonderful because it comes right at this moment. Those of you who've read the novel might remember, it comes right at this moment where Clarissa Dalloway has sort of ascended to her attic bedroom with her sort of narrow virginal bed. And she's thinking about how she has failed her husband. And you are, I believe, supposed to believe that she had failed him sexually. And she is thinking about what it is that she lacked. And she thinks, well, it was something else, but something that she sometimes felt with women. And then you get this sort of wonderful orgasmic description of that feeling spreading and rushing until the world is filled with some astonishing significance. But then at the end of it, you get that very strange invocation of the cracks and the sores, right? Which is not something we tend to think of or want to think of alongside sexual activity, sexual climax, right? So at the same time that you're thinking about that kind of orgasmic rush, I think you're also thinking about pus, the emptying of a wound. And there's something about the sexuality here that's quite pestilent, which I think makes sense when you think about the fact that she's describing an essentially queer experience. It's an experience that she believes or seems to have sort of moved away from in her marriage to Richard. And that it makes her uncomfortable, right? That it is an uncomfortable thing. It's hard to know how to place it. Where does one place one's girlhood infatuations? How do you understand the queerness of that? And there's quite a lot of interesting debate about whether you read Mrs. Dalloway as a lesbian novel or not. And it's wonderful to me too, because it then echoes a moment that you get later on with Septimus, where that language is repeated precisely, the world sort of rushing close, and time splitting its husks and pouring all over. Except there, the language, he thinks something like time splitting its husks and pouring hard shells. and you think they're not of pestilence, but of war, of the shells sort of dropping in time, right? And what becomes clear is that the underside or the flip side of every experience of rapture or ecstasy in the novel is something that is fearful, something that is painful, something that is life-threatening in one way or another. And one of the things that I talk about in the kind of longer version of this lecture is how, Woolf tends to get read as a kind of stream of consciousness writer. And I think people use that term a little bit lazily, as if creating something that resembled human consciousness meant that the writer herself, the author herself, was just kind of putting her pen down on paper and writing whatever came into her mind, right? But one of the things that's really extraordinary is how meticulous Woolf was about planning this novel, how meticulous she was from shaping its chapters, the interludes, to even making sure that there were these correspondences of words at moments where it was clear she wanted Septimus and Clarissa, there to be echoes of Septimus in what Clarissa was thinking or saying or doing, and echoes of Clarissa in what Septimus was thinking or saying or doing. And those two passages, the one that I just read, and then the one with time splitting its husk, those are the two that come immediately to mind for me.
Great. Well, we're almost to the end of the hour, and this has been such a wonderful discussion. If anybody has any last minute questions, please send them into the Q&A or the chat. Oh, great. We've got a question from Dan, who says, in Orlando, Woolf writes about the characters have innumerable selves. Was it 2,000 or so? Do you think Woolf might consider her fictional characters as expression of her own myriad selves?
I mean, of course, that's certainly possible. One of my favorite moments in Mrs. Dalloway is that moment when Clarissa is sitting and looking at her mirror. And this happens right after the moment that you and I were just talking about, that rushing moment. She's sitting and looking at her mirror and she's thinking, this is who she was when some effort called on her to be herself, right? This dart-like pointed person coming to a kind of diamond-like shape. And she thinks only she knew how many selves were behind that person. And I think what Woolf knows, and that what anyone sort of knows as they get older, is that sometimes it's very hard to recognize the self that you were in the past with the self that you are in the present. And that question of how do you integrate all of my past selves into the person, the singular person that I am now, that question is a very difficult one to answer, and possibly maybe an impossible one to answer. And so I like reading that moment of her in front of the mirror, along with that moment when she and Peter Walsh are speaking, and she says, do you remember the lake? And her voice catches and she thinks, for she was a child now, holding her life in her arms and bringing it to her parents until it became a complete life, a whole life. And that fantasy that one could have a whole life, that like a ball or like a bundle of flowers you could present to anybody and say, this is it, right? That's a very powerful fantasy. And that is in some ways what the novel as a form tries to do, is try to contain all of a life within its pages. And so the novel is ultimately the thing that you present and say, here it is, here's a life, here's a full life, the life of Mrs. Dalloway, right?
All right, and then our last question, someone is asking, I love the images you used throughout, I think the annotated version. Were there any that you would have liked to use, but you couldn't for whatever reason?
Oh, I mean, there are so many. It's so expensive to license. I mean, this is just a kind of pragmatic and unpoetic answer, but it is just extraordinarily expensive to license these kinds of images. And what added to that was that this whole book was produced during the pandemic, so the archives weren't open. And so a lot of this book, I mean, in addition to an annotated edition leaning hard on the work of the scholars that have come before you and the annotators that have come before you, this one leans particularly hard on the labor of many, many, many archivists and librarians, including the wonderful librarians at the Houghton Library at Harvard, where Virginia Woolf's photo albums are. And so there were so many. I would have loved to include more manuscript pages because I think just showing people the entirety of the notes where she's actually plotting out the novel and at what time which character is going to go where and how 11 o'clock will be the airplane hour and her continuous revision of the intervals so that they're each kind of doing something different. I would have loved to show people all of that just to really get the point across of how well planned, how thoroughly planned this novel was. And then there were a number of images from Vanessa Bell's estate that I think would have also been lovely to use. So I think the ones that we use are her two famous portraits of Virginia Woolf, her famous flowers that are hanging in the Tate, and her portrait of Duncan Grant in front of a mirror with a head cold, which opens the section where Peter walks and looks at his own reflection in a shop window, either a car or a shop window, I can't remember. And he thinks, I'm not old, I'm not old. And there's something wonderful about the way she's painted Duncan Grant with like a scarf over his head with a cold looking at the mirror. And you can just imagine him thinking, I'm not old, I'm not sick, I'm not old, I'm not sick. But there were others, particularly from Charleston, some of the very beautiful images from the wall hangings there that would have been nice to use.
Wow, I wish that we could spend the next hour talking about this. This has been so absolutely pleasant, Merve.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, do you have any closing thoughts, any takeaways from this project that you want to share before we say our goodbyes?
Maybe just that in the Academy, at least, annotating and editing, beautifying or prettifying a text is often thought of as women's work, the work that women do, which I find quite frustrating because for me, at least, doing this is in some ways the closest I've gotten to a single work of literature, and has simply taught me how to read in many, many, many different kinds of ways. And so I strongly encourage those of you who have a favorite novel and one that you want to inhabit more deeply to just try writing a couple of pages of it out, because I think you'll find that it brings you closer to it than you thought might be possible.
That's a lovely sentiment, and I'm going to try that.
An exercise, a homework assignment.
Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Thanks to everyone watching for your thoughtful questions, for spending part of your Sunday hanging out with us, talking about this great book. If you don't have a copy of the Annotated Mrs. Dalloway, I just posted the link again in the chat. It's really, really stunning, even if you have the novel already. Great. And yeah, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night. Keep reading and please be well. Thank you. Bye.